Today's topic is how to write epic fight scenes faster and have fun in the process.
Fight scenes can either draw your readers into the story and keep them flipping the pages, or it can cause them to close the book and set it aside and disengage from your story because they're boring.
The problem is writing fight scenes, battles, or conflict that don't bore the reader is difficult and time-consuming. So we have 7 writing tips for you to help you write epic battle scenes really fast and have fun in the process.
Big shout out to Beige Boss 95 for the great topic idea and question. They ask, would it be possible to show how to describe battle scenes? Yes, we're going to give it a shot. Let's go.
First, you want to establish the purpose of the fight. You may want to further the story, develop your characters, or perhaps you want to increase tension. But by defining that in your mind before you write the fight, it'll help you stay on track and help you engage the reader on a deeper level.
A fight scene or a conflict should have a purpose beyond creating action. Simply having explosions or punches or arguments or things like that can actually be boring if there's not a reason for that to happen. There needs to be a reason, a purpose that furthers the story.
Think about this example. Joe stood up from his bar stool and shoved the guy next to him into another fellow. Within minutes, fists were flying. Joe slipped on a puddle of beer and fell to the ground. He crawled out the door to escape. This may be interesting, but what's the purpose? So consider this example instead. Joe watched the officer enter the dimly lit bar. He slid under the table and crawled behind a group of guys before standing and shoving one of them into the group. Falling back to the ground, he watched fists flying and the chaos that followed. He stayed low and moved toward the back door.
Is the second example more interesting than the first one? I think so, because there's a reason for it. He's obviously trying to escape unnoticed and creating a diversion. And that's a really simple example, but let me ask you a question that will help you as you write these type of fight scenes in your story. If you remove the fight scene from your story, is your story negatively impacted? If it's not, then you probably didn't need the fight scene at all and you should remove it. So your character may be fighting for love or vengeance or just for fun, any number of motivations the character may have, but it needs to make sense in the story and further the story with a real purpose, or you just don't need it in the story.
Make sure the reader understands why the fight is happening and what's at risk.
So our second tip to help your writing move faster and be better is to keep the characters in mind. An action scene, a fight sequence, a major conflict, a battle, or even a simple argument has to fit the characters as well as the story.
By asking these questions before you start writing a fight scene, you can write faster and better and have fun. What does your character want or need? Why is your character choosing to fight? And what kind of feeling do you want to evoke in the reader?
Let's use Joe in another example. Joe watched as the guy slammed his fist into the table and yelled at the waitress to stay out of it. Joe's foot tapped rapidly and his face became hot. He sniffed slowly and looked down at the hot hickory bacon on his plate. Foul language pulled his eyes back to the argument a few tables down. He dropped his fork, rose, and headed for the cashier just beyond the argument. I don't need this today, he thought. Before he reached the cashier, the man slapped the kid sitting across from him. The sound echoed in his ears, and everyone in the cafe turned to watch. Joe froze. He looked at the kid who crouched on the bench. A small red trickle ran down the boy's lip. Whimpers filled the air. Joe tried to turn away, but the flood of memories held him. His chest pounded as he watched the man raise his hand to strike again. Joe's sweaty fingers wrapped around the man's arm and pulled him into a standing position. The two stood face to face as people scattered. Conflicts like this can hint at backstory, develop deeper characters, and help your readers connect on an emotional level. However, if there's not a reason for this type of a conflict, then you're better to leave it out because it's going to disengage the reader because there isn't really a reason for it.
Third is to use as many senses as possible in the conflict. You want to describe the scene through the eyes of the character. What does the character see, hear, smell, taste, feel in that moment?
An immersive scene, whether it's a fight scene or an argument or any other type of conflict, makes use of multiple senses. And the more you can engage in those senses, the more it's going to draw your reader in and captivate them. The more intense or ruthless the fight is, the more you need to engage all of the senses in that conflict to help draw the reader into what's happening. So let me ask you, how many senses did I include in the example that I gave earlier? Was it enough? Did I describe enough, engage the senses enough to elicit an emotional response? I think so, but that's what you want to aim for. You want to include as many of the senses as you can to draw the reader in so they have an emotional reaction to what's happening.
Describe the sight of blood and the sound of a punch and the feel of the collision and the smell of sweat. I mean, that's a great one.
Yeah.
There's so many things you can engage there.
What about the taste of fear?
I know. Can you imagine? Oh, that's a great one. But whatever you add into that scene, you want to make sure that it fits the story, fits the character, and that it makes sense.
Our fourth writing tip to help you write faster and better fight scenes is to make sure that the fight scene doesn't slow the pacing of the story. And this is really important when you dig into it because the pacing of the story, especially in a fight scene, is really critical. So your shorter sentences are going to speed up the pacing. Longer sentences are going to slow down the pacing. And you want a mixture of both of those, and you also want to include some dialogue because that will break it up some of the monotony of the he punch, she punch type of thing and help your pacing to balance out a little bit.
A good thing to remember is the more details you have, the slower it's going to go. The less details, it's going to speed it up.
When I write fight scenes, I like to slow the pacing down so that it builds tension and allows the reader to have an emotional reaction to what's happening, and then speed it up again to keep the story moving. So in my example, did you notice the difference in pacing when Joe was sitting at the table, looking at his bacon, trying to figure out what's going on, versus when he's standing up and interacting with the conflict? So if your fight scene goes on too long, you can actually lose the reader because they become bored with it. Fight scenes should generally be fairly short, maybe a page or two. Now, if it's an epic battle in the whole story, maybe it's going to be a little bit longer than that, sure. But a lot of the arguments and fight scenes should be relatively short with a purpose and focused on what's happening. So make sure to keep a balance in that with the appropriate amount of dialogue, your word choice, your sentence structure, and the length of the sentence. All of that goes into keeping the pacing correct so that you have a great fight scene and you're moving the story on.
This goes right into the next point, which is you don't need to state everything that's happening. A blow by blow of punches, he punched, she punched, bam, 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 that can really become monotonous and boring and slow things down. When you describe absolutely everything and everyone involved, that can really slow the pacing. And so you want to only state the things that really matter for that scene.
Including too much will also turn down the emotional response that you're trying to create in the conflict. So let's explore this for a minute. If we go back to the example of Joe in the cafe, did it create an emotional response? Did you have an emotional reaction to what was happening there?
Yes. Yes.
So then let me ask you, what happened to the waitress? What happened to the other people at the table? Who was at the table?
Who was at the table? I am very curious about that.
Did anyone call the police?
They should have.
They should have. But none of that was included in the story because I felt like it would be a distraction, that it would lessen the emotional response that I wanted to create and bring the intensity down. So if you include too much, then you risk distracting the reader and lessening the emotional response that you want to create. You don't have to describe everything and everyone in a fight scene. Stay focused on exactly what's happening, and that will make it better. I've also found that when I try to put too much in a fight scene or an epic battle or even an argument, that I end up on the telling side of things rather than showing what's happening. And that's really a critical thing because I struggle with telling anyway. So you want to watch that. If you're trying to make too much or describe too much, you may end up just telling rather than showing what's happening.
And that's a great point because you want to remember to brush up on your show don't tell techniques before you write a fight scene. And funny thing, we actually have a video about that, and we'll put the link for that in the description so you can check that out.
Our sixth tip is don't forget that fights have consequences. If I were to go back and finish the fight scene with Joe in the cafe, I would include things like somebody being arrested, bruises, cuts, the emotional trauma, and so on. Because we've got to remember that physical fights, physical altercations, and even arguments have consequences.
I learned when I took jiu-jitsu classes that going toe-to-toe with another human being has physical consequences. There is an effect on both parties, whether you're the winner or the loser. And these effects can happen during the fight, which is very interesting. It can even happen after the fight.
Conflicts also have an impact on relationships. So whether it's her taking jiu-jitsu class and we're having an altercation and then I'm sore the next day, or if it's Joe in the cafe, maybe he was late for an appointment or an interview or got fired from his job. It could be that he was detained by the police so long that he missed a date and now, he missed that opportunity.
Yeah.
Poor guy.
Poor guy.
So we have to remember that the physical altercations also have long-term and short-term consequences in relationships. And when you take those little tidbits and you scatter them out throughout the story, it makes the story more interesting, ties it together, and the consequences of that conflict can be far-reaching.
Our seventh writing tip is do your research. As with any type of writing that we do, we want to do the appropriate amount of research. Now, I have heard some people say, well, I write fight scenes and I don't know anything about fighting. And I disagree with that. When I first started writing fight scenes, they were terrible.
Yes, they were. They were terrible. They were terrible.
They were. I knew nothing about fighting.
That's how I got drawn into writing the fiction with her, because I read the fight scenes and went, that's horrible.
Yes. So he had to help me a lot with them. But then we took 2 years of jiu-jitsu classes. Great exercise, but also it taught me a lot about fighting because I actually did it with my own body. I physically experienced that, and so I understood fighting. After that, I could write a fight scene because I knew what it looked like and I knew what it felt like.
And it was a much better fight scene. I got to give you that.
Now, in the Electrical Saga, book 1, there's a scene in there where the characters fight with staffs. Well, I didn't learn how to fight with a staff. I had never experienced that, so I had to do some research. I built upon my own experience by watching videos, watching tutorials about how to handle a staff and what a staff fight would look like. And I watched some movies that had choreographed staff fights in them, and I made note of what worked and what didn't and how that would look. And then I was able to write that fight scene.
What you're writing will dictate the type and amount of research that you need to do, but don't skimp on the research. Maybe you want to take a martial arts class, or maybe
you should. It's fun.
It's fun. Maybe you want to go to a gun range and shoot. Maybe if your story has a lot of police interaction, you want to see if you can go on a ride along with one of the officers and experience that. Never underestimate the value of hands-on personal experience and what that can do to transform your writing.
If you like this video, watch this one about how to write conflict and tension.
Now, if you've ever written a fight scene, we would love to have your comments, your interaction, and if you haven't, well, maybe either if you have or haven't, pick up where I left off with Joe in the cafe and finish that fight scene. What would happen? We would love to have your insights on how the fight scene should progress, what to include, and what to focus on. We'll see you next time.